Spiritual narcissism is getting out of control. There seems to be an ever-increasing horde of sacred space junkies and selectively spiritual yogis, but I've discovered something fascinating at the intersection between spiritual psychology, religious studies, and modern trauma therapy. Spiritual narcissists aren't to be feared or condemned. This isn't a top 5 ways to gain back your power over the narcissist kind of video, because there is such a thing as healthy narcissism. It's very healthy and often very healing for someone to identify and relate to their breakthroughs and revelations as they go along that path from pain to health. I know that I've been there, and if I'm honest, there's definitely still a significant part of me that might be considered a spiritual narcissist. But we need to go a little bit deeper into the conversation and try and identify the exact moment in time where spiritual narcissism became the main thread of spirituality, because it wasn't this way throughout all of human history. We're going to go deep into the books and hopefully try and find a way to break against this modern cultural trend of the self becoming God. That may be pleasant, but is it healthy? Well, today we're going to be going into 4 books, including the Quran and the Holy Bible, in addition to some esoteric psychology and some historical studies of the New Age movement, as well as some work on the inferiority complex to try and map out this broad discussion around spiritual narcissism, the God complex, and hopefully giving you a few tools to, firstly, identify your own spiritual narcissism, and secondly, be able to better relate to people who you have in your life who you suspect might be falling a little bit far along the spectrum of narcissistic spirituality. Where do we begin? I reckon that we begin with the classic in this space, and that is a work from 1950 by Alice Bailey called Glamour, a World Problem. If you've seen me hold up these little blue books before, it's because Alice Bailey, as she lives over on this shelf, is one of the best esoteric psychologists I've come across in my years of study, and this book, this 70-year-old book, has an excellent description of what it's like to be the person who's discovering spirituality for the first time, to be discovering the whole world of possibilities deep inside your psyche, and that kind of feeling of soul contact. So there's an extended extract that I want to read to frame this conversation so that we're on the same page, and then we're going to go into the history, and we're going to go into the practical suggestions about how to unravel all of this overcharged energy and hopefully have something like healthy divinity rather than considering yourself to be God, which is simply untrue. If you're willing to go through the conflict, then let's have the conversation. Let's turn to the book. Quote from the book about the nature of spiritual delusion and illusion. Very confronting. Please hold on to your hat. An aspirant succeeds in contacting his soul or ego through right effort. We're meeting Alice Bailey at this moment where she's describing what's happening when someone's been in meditation for a few years or maybe had a breakthrough mystical experience. This is the person, their inner world, this is what's happening, right? Through meditation, good intention, and correct technique, plus the desire to serve and to love, he achieves alignment. He becomes then aware of the results of his successful work. His mind is illuminated. A sense of power flows through his vehicles. Old language means basically his spiritual bodies. That's what Alice Bailey is talking about, the astral etheric elements, if you want to go there. He is temporarily, at least, made aware of the plan. This is very much the divine, universal, God-given mission, all coming through to the spiritual aspirant. What a wonderful place to be in. Lots of grandiosity and bypassing we need to be bewaring of. The needs of the world and the capacity of the soul to meet that need flood his consciousness. His dedication, consecration, and right purpose enhance the directed inflow of spiritual energy. He knows, he loves, he seeks to serve and does all three more or less successfully. The result of all this is that he becomes more and more engrossed with a sense of power, and with the part he is to play in aiding humanity than he is with the realization of due and proper sense of proportion and spiritual values. Savage. A little bit more on the quote. He overestimates his experience and himself, instead of redoubling his efforts and thus establishing a closer contact with the kingdom of souls and loving all beings more deeply, he begins to call attention to himself. We're getting into real spiritual narcissist territory. Calls attention to the mission that he is to develop and to the confidence that the master and even the planetary logos apparently have in him. He talks about himself, he gestures and attracts, noticing and demanding recognition, and as he does so, his alignment is steadily impaired. His contact lessens and he joins the ranks of the many who have succumbed to the illusion of sensed power. Highly recommend you read this book for yourself. It is page after page of heavy-hitting, confrontational, very healing information. I think my reread of this book, which is when I sit down at my laptop to type up my notes, was about 35 to 40 pages of Google Docs. It's such a dense book, and it is page after page of this kind of energy, and also a hell of a lot of esoteric psychology. There's a lot there to unpack, but I do want to lead a little bit more into this topic because there's a follow-on quote which will really frame the sense of spiritual narcissism, at least from the emotional angle that maybe you can relate to, because I can certainly relate to some of that quote in regards to feeling like you've got contact with the plan and you know what you're here for, and what an incredible, hot air up your rear end kind of experience. One final quote from Alice Bailey, then we're going to go into the history, and then we're going to turn to the sacred texts. This is really savage. Just be prepared. This is what happens when the spiritual narcissist doesn't realize that they've become narcissistic, and actually it just gets worse and worse, and even their intended goal of becoming a spiritual person who's in contact with divinity and gives that to the world, that becomes an impossibility at a certain point. So this is the warning sign of what happens if we don't catch our own spiritual narcissism. The mind is still self-centered, the contact is feeble, and the alignment uncertain. The ideas are therefore only dimly sensed, but the uniqueness of the experience and the realized content of the mind of the disciple leads him deeper into the realm of illusion. There's almost this moment of scrabbling for more information, and as you go deeper and deeper and narrower into your particular soul journey or spiritual story, you become more and more delusional. The ideas or idea which he has contacted are, if he could realize, only a fragment of a far greater whole. That which he brings to their interpretation is inadequate. The idea which has emerged in his consciousness, though he does have a partial awakening of his intuition, will be distorted in its descent to his brain consciousness in several ways. The equipment, meaning his body or his intuition or his rational capacity, does not suffice for accuracy. Truly, truly important, humble-making statement right there. Your brain and your intuition and your heart and even your sense of knowing in your guts may not be as sharp and precise as you think. This is what happens when someone has a particularly heavy or important feeling dream, and because they haven't necessarily studied too much around esoteric theory or symbolism, they might just go off a quick Google search of what does the symbol of a fox mean and what does the number 4 mean in a dream, and then go onto a random astrology site and go, Mercury is indeed in retrograde, I'm going to put all this together, and therefore I've got my story of the week. It's a very tricky space to be in, because if you don't have the humility to realize that your spiritual inflow, meaning from down going upwards and from up going downwards, might be a little bit shaky, it might, again, as I've mentioned in previous videos, let me put this book down, as in previous videos, you've got the trauma pipe, and if you haven't cleared out your trauma pipe, you've got gunk like moss and dirt and all bits of debris and bits of plastic that when you pour the water through, the spiritual water of inspiration and revelation, you're not going to end up with a divinely inspired liquid nectar, milk and honey, golden light experience. You're actually going to be seeing a lot of yourself reflected in the spiritual experience that you're having. For example, if you're someone who hasn't healed the childhood trauma around a particularly abusive fatherly figure, you're not very likely to get many positive experiences of masculine spiritual direction. You're likely to over-associate with something like the Earth Mother concept, or grandmother this, or great mother this, or goddess this or that. This shift towards a feminine-centric spirituality, which, if you peel it back, might have a lot to do with the fact that you ran away from your father, or you avoided the anger of your father to hide in the skirt of your mother. Or maybe you were the caretaker for your mother. Maybe even as an adult right now, you still give your mom a lot more energy than maybe would be appropriate as two adults in an adult relationship. There's many ways to unpack the story. I'm not saying this is particularly the full story. I'm trying to indicate the example of what happens if you don't clear out this pipe and you're pouring in the spiritual energy, not realizing that you may not be seeing clearly, and just stepping back and realizing that you don't have the full picture. So don't try and take a snapshot of a corner of that frame and expand it into the full narrative of who you are, what your soul is, and what your divine plan is on earth. You probably haven't got all the information. So just step back and we'll go a little bit deeper. Let's move on to the second book in today's video, which again is actually one of my top 5 books in this library. My reread, I think, was about 50, if not 60 pages. It is New Age Religion and Western Culture by Wouter Hanegraaff, an incredible 400 or 500 page take on the entire New Age movement, moving from the esotericism in the Middle Ages into the theosophical movements in the 19th century, and then the gradual consumerization of that process in the 60s, 70s, and especially the 80s. Through reading this book, I've started to come to an understanding that the spiritual narcissist concept, unlike the old school monk in the monastery in Asia, or maybe the classic nun in the English monastery, let's say, in the Middle Ages, spiritual life was something which is isolated. Spiritual life was something which was for a very small number of people who would go off and live a very dedicated life based on, usually, holy books like the Quran or the Bible or the other Eastern texts. Now we have a very different situation because spirituality can be purchased to some degree, at least the raiments or the, raiments is a word that not many people might know, at least the vestige, I was going to say vestige, at least the appearance of the spirituality with the chakra crystal around your neck and the nice flowy bohemian clothes and your favorite bamboo yoga mat. You can perform the spirituality that you may not have at depth, which is a very different experience from brown robes or orange robes or minimum white robes in some kind of classic monastic tradition. There's something about the old school way being withdrawing from the world. No technology, no one knows you're there. It's you and your teacher, your fellow colleagues or students or brothers or sisters, and your relationship to God. Now we have smartphones and we can publicly distribute our spiritual image and benefit from all kinds of crazy shadow territory. A book like New Age Religion and Western Culture is well worth you purchasing. I actually went on Amazon and left a review for this book. I think I might be one of the only reviewers. If you want to go on Amazon, you'll see me right there in the comments section, because I wish that more people had read this. Got a quote to read out which talks about the shadow of the New Age. We're going to finish up on framing this idea around spiritual narcissism, hopefully identify this moment, I think, around the end of the 1970s, at the quelling of the initial energy of the hippie love and light of the late 50s into the 60s. And then there was this I'll paint it out this way. You've got 1960s energy of hippiness and love and light and healing and all kinds of breakthroughs, even in the therapy space. Lots of great therapy with the humanistic movement in particular coming out in the 1960s. That rides through into the 70s, but then you have this other wave of neoliberal capitalism and like consumer yuppie culture and lots of spending in the 80s. You got Thatcher in the UK, for example, and it's all coming together at like late 70s into the 80s where they start to cross. And that's when we start to really see the commodification of self-development and spiritual self-development in a whole variety of very interesting dynamics to observe. That's a lot of history. What I'm going to do for the sake of this video is bring out a quote that talks about the shadow of the New Age, because this was a quote written by someone called David Spangler, who was a very important figure in the New Age movement, I think in the 80s, and he's talking about the shadow from someone who's on the inside looking out. So this is painting the culture. Firstly, we painted the individual aspirant who gets delusional or at the very least ungrounded because of their lack of discernment. That was what Alice Bailey taught us. Now we're going to look at the culture at large. We'll weave the two together, and then we'll find some advice to take forwards and hopefully become a little bit more humble. Quote from the book: "The shadows of the new age are alienation from the past in the name of the future," which means not many people read the Bible or the Quran or even the main religious texts from history because we believe that the Instagram teacher or the YouTube teacher or the latest workshop that we attend is actually the cutting edge. Or maybe we go in this bypassing sense of ancient history, ancient Atlantis, ancient Lemuria, and we forget the last 3,000 years and go back 5,000, 6,000, 10,000 years or more. Maybe we just launch off to a different planetary system. There's something overcharged about that response, and that's what's being mentioned here. Again, people need different things at different stages of their journey. Just bear with me if you like some of these ideas. My intention is to bring awareness. I don't want to shame or condemn anyone. I get it. The shadow of the new age is alienation from the past in the name of the future, attachment to novelty for its own sake without a proper alignment to history and tradition, indiscriminateness and lack of discernment in the name of wholeness and communion, hence the failure to understand or respect the role of boundaries and limits, selfishness arising from misplaced self-development, a subtle surrender to powerlessness and irresponsibility in the name of waiting for the new age to come rather than being an active creator of wholeness in one's life. Another way to say that is the person who leans a bit too heavy into manifestation or leans a bit too heavy into cliches like God has a plan for me, the universe knows what it's doing, and removes that sense of personal agency. That's also a very spiritually narcissistic way of relating to the world, because even if you think the story isn't your story, the narrative that you're repeating to yourself is that God, i.e. another power outside of me or a power that I'm a part of, will take care of this for me. One possible perspective interpretation that could be the highest possible ideal of consciousness, which is to truly be an integrated human being, but if we take it from a different angle, it's also the thinking of the 3-year-old who's waiting for daddy to come home and fix the problem with his toys. It's both and it's neither. It's up to you to decide where is it actually coming from, that leaning into the cliche. Let's finish off the quote. There's so much to unpack here. I could really do several videos on this, and that's why I've also done probably 10 videos on spiritual narcissism and grandiosity and ego inflation, but let's finish the quote. Continuing the list. Identifying the new age primarily as an event rather than as a process. This is people who look forward to things like the age of Aquarius or have certain narratives around revelation, which is actually very linked back into certain Christian ideals of, the end times, but a whole nother topic. And finally, and the new age perspective with the ultimate truth. Tell you what, channeling, spirituality, and there's a whole variety of things that I really do recommend that you go into. This is such an incredibly dense and one of the best books. These are two of the best books I have in the library. They're in the course. They are top 13, but realistically I'd say, top whatever. Don't need to rank it. The point is, read the books for yourself. And we've now framed out the individual spiritual narcissist as embedded in a culture of spiritual narcissism. What we need to understand is that the individual is a product of the collective, and the collective reinforces the individual. There is no escaping society. And if you take someone, let's turn to Alfred Adler for a moment. If you take Alfred Adler, who was an incredible psychologist working at the time of Freud and Jung, and his original theory of the inferiority complex, this is the man who coined that term. He was looking at the inferiority complex and the strivings to power which come as a reactive response to feelings of inferiority. If we understand that the inferior individual is only really left with the option of either remaining inferior or overcharging themselves into a superior position, we start to understand why the disenchanted, lost, traumatized, otherwise wounded man or woman who stumbles into the commune with kind of hesitant eyes, but then a month later is right there in white doing the kirtan around the leader the photo of the leader or whatever in the circle, and they're all singing together. How does that happen? How, within such a short period of time, can a traumatized and scared individual enter into a group and suddenly be such a massive advocate for that group psychology? It's because they're wounded at a very young psychological age, and that youthful wounding carries through in terms of their healing pattern. So rather than being an adult who's going into a space and coming out of a space and benefiting and moving, they go all the way in, because it's more like 4 or 5-year-old consciousness. I'm not saying that everyone who's in these communities is at 4 or 5-year-old consciousness. I'm saying about the particular unconscious trauma dynamic of finding your group, finding your community, going to the sacred plant medicine space and stumbling from circle to circle to circle. It's very much like the 5-year-old. Where's my mummy? Where's my daddy? Can you help me find my mummy? I'm scared. Where's mummy? And looking for a hand to hold, to reach up and hopefully have your hand held and lifted up. And then you'll defend those people who protected you. And it's such a tricky topic to talk about. I hope it's clear that I'm not trying to condemn any particular group, but I want you to have the awareness of what's happening. The spiritual narcissist doesn't come from nowhere. There's a culture of narcissism, a culture of self-reflective over-identification, with spirituality being something which is this very healthy but then overcharged response to inferiority. It's completely appropriate, responding to today's question, to recognize the divinity of your soul, the righteousness and beauty and lovability of your essence in a godly manner almost. But don't make the step ahead to believe that you are God. Do not elevate yourself to godliness, because then we end up in the territory of cult leaders and false gurus and manipulative men and women. There's only so long that you can stay inside the story that you are indeed God before you either collapse everything into God, as I've mentioned on a few videos. If you're God and everything is God, then so are the trees, and so is your neighbor, and so is my dog, and so is my cashier, and so is my bathroom toilet. Wait a minute, not my bathroom toilet, because that's inanimate. But wait a minute, what about the anima theory of all things being living? It gets into very tricky narrative territory. Don't collapse into that narrative. We need to have a healthy sense of humility. The God complex forms as a response once more to the inferiority complex, because if a young boy or a young girl does not have a healthy mother or a healthy father to temporarily hold the God image, or ideally God itself to hold the God image, the imago Dei, the image of God, a culture of religiousness which isn't about an individual human. The priest is not God. The priest points towards God. The Buddhist monk, again, is not God, but is talking about something which is this sea of godliness that we're consumed in. Whole variety of religious history. The important point is that if there's a young and fragile and vulnerable inferior feeling part inside of you, you don't need to exaggerate towards either calling someone else God, especially not a human being, or considering yourself to be God. Let's turn towards two very cherry-picked quotes from both the Bible and the Quran, just to wrap us up into a sense of tradition, because I truly believe that the remedy for spiritual narcissism is humility. It's understanding that we don't know what we're doing here. We are working it out as we go, and this is why pride was one of the 7 deadly sins. I'm not saying you need to feel shameful and abused by the tyranny of God, but maybe it's worthwhile to listen to some of these words. I've got an extract here from Proverbs 16:18 in the Holy Bible. Very small extract. Pride goes before destruction, and a haughty spirit before a fall. It is better to be humble in spirit with the lowly than to divide the spoil with the proud. He who pays attention to the word of God will find good, and blessed is he who trusts in the Lord. You don't need to be Christian to understand the essence of what's being communicated there. It's very much about having a sense of worship which goes beyond looking in the mirror and worshipping yourself. There's a period of time where it's important to recognize just how loving you are, doing some mirror meditations. Sure, Love yourself. I've been through that. I did a period of maybe 3 months of mirror meditations twice per day. It was incredibly important for my sense of recognizing myself and feeling like I was a beautiful man who had something to give. But I don't take that extra step to become God. Here we have an extract from the Quran, Surah 31, Luqman, quote from the Quran, "And do not turn your nose up to people, nor walk pridefully upon the earth. Surely Allah does not like whoever is arrogant or boastful. Be moderate in your pace, and lower your voice." Lower your voice, for the ugliest of all voices is certainly the braying of donkeys, and if you sound like a bit of a hee-haw repetition of cliche New Age truths about the universe, and all money is coming towards you, and everyone is love and light, and you're starting to fall into these ideas, maybe we could learn a little bit from the Quran and this idea of maybe quite humorously taking on the jester archetype and going, wow, I might be a bit of a donkey repeating phrases that I don't truly understand right now. And what if we were just a little bit more humble? What if we just lowered the intensity of how often we consider ourselves, and we took the best of the teachings from the holy books and actually focused on giving that out to others, rather than giving others the idealized, chakra-infused, fully draped out spiritual persona, which is nothing less than a false self. That's the core of narcissism. The narcissist is not in love with him or herself. They are attached and fixated on a false self-image, which may give the appearance of self-love, but they're deeply shameful and deeply self-loathing. You go back all the way into the inferiority complex and all the way into the wounding which made you feel like you weren't enough. And you heal those wounds at the core, rather than building a false self-narrative with a bit of a spiritual twist, finding your community, and everybody mutually reinforces each other. And guess what happens? I've seen it time and time again. 3 years, 5 years, maybe 10 years deep into that journey, most people get a moment where they're in the meditation circle or at yet another plant medicine ritual, and they realize that this isn't the thing. Something's missing at the foundation. They are building on stilts, and although they went very high up into very wonderful, often very real transpersonal psychological territory, they missed some of the steps along the way, and their core identity, their healthy, mature ego identity, which is complemented by a sense of spiritual infusion, isn't quite built out. So they just took some cardboard cutout ideas of what makes a spiritual person. What if we just avoid that process? If there's someone that you know who's still in that process, maybe this video is something useful for you to share with them. Maybe they'll get quite triggered, so actually probably don't do that. It's not like, hey, I was watching this video and I thought of you, spiritual narcissism. It's like, maybe don't do that. But at the very least, you can be supportive and understanding, because I recognize that at certain stages in my healing journey, when I got my first mystical revelations and I'd be out and about in nature and feel like I heard the voice of God, it's very tempting to call yourself a shaman or a mystic or a seer or a clairvoyant. But just hold off. Just hold off on that. If it's true, lower your voice and people will reflect back to you that you might have something that's a little bit extrasensory. But definitely hold off on putting it on your Instagram, and maybe reconsider building a business around this a little bit too early, especially if you haven't even read the main holy books or done research into transpersonal psychology, being the main place to go when you're trying to understand higher level psychological constructs. Just do your research, lower your own self-importance, and then you get all of the actual benefits of being a genuinely spiritual person without that feeling of being inflated to such a point that the only possible option, when you've gone too far into the inflation, too far into the grandiosity, is the balloon with the pin, and you will pop. And then you'll repeat the cycle all over again and just make a whole new false self, a whole new persona, and it'll take you about 5 years before you do it over and over and over again. A bit of a dark message to leave this video on, but I think that's the truth as best as I understand it right now. I hope that these books are useful for you. Again, Glamour by Alice Bailey, New Age Religion and Western Culture by Wouter Hanegraaff. You can research someone like Alfred Adler, and please take the time to read the sacred traditions before you go into the New Age space and believe that you're beyond them. Because the Bible, the the Quran, and the holy texts of the East, they're well worth your study. I don't need to say any more. That's the end of the video. Let's all ground ourselves and be a little bit more humble. I'll see you over on the next video.